We got it. All right. Thank you all for coming. My name is Sarah, and I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at McFarland. And it's always a joy to have Ron Larson come and impart his wisdom of McFarland with us. So tonight we get to learn about what he deems as the 4 turning points in McFarland history. So, Ron, take it away.
Thank you, and thanks, Sarah, and thanks to Ben and the McFarland's Communications Division for being here tonight in the village of McFarland. I appreciate all the opportunities that Sarah and the library give me to speak to you. So it's turning into an annual event every February, so I'm here to talk about McFarland history, and I'll never run out of topics, so expect to see me for another 10 years maybe. But yeah, tonight is 4 turning points in McFarland history, and as Sarah said, the 4 points that I deem important, but you might have other opinions on that. But after studying McFarland history for a number of years, these are 4 topics that I thought were worthy of being mentioned as a turning point. And we, as we go along, if you want to guess to yourself, okay, what's the next turning point? I'll make it into a little game. But then at the end of my presentation, hopefully some of you will speak up and suggest another event that could have been incorporated in this talk, as well as you might think of a turning point. But we'll get to that in just a little while. But so starting off, I will go to the first turning point. Well, before that, let's talk about what a turning point is. And the four events that I'm going to talk about, I think, are covered by these explanations of what a turning point is. And so the first turning point in McFarland history is the railroad. That's pretty obvious, because without the railroad, McFarland wouldn't be here. It's an interesting turning point by itself, because within the railroad coming to McFarland, there were a number of smaller turning points that would make the railroad come through this area. And a couple of years ago, I had a presentation on the railroad history in McFarland, and I had this map, and it kind of demonstrates how lucky McFarland is that the railroad actually came through here. Because it all started in 1850 when they started building the railroad in Milwaukee, and their destination was the Mississippi River. And the easiest way to get to the Mississippi River would be to go directly west from Milwaukee, and that would take it through Madison and then to the Mississippi River. But as you can see, they didn't go exactly in a westward direction. Once they got to Waukesha, they angled to the southwest. And the railroad, as it was known to do, bowed to pressure from rich individuals or from communities willing to do whatever it took to get the railroad to come to their locality. And that's what happened when it turned southwest. A man named Joseph Goodrich lived in Milton. He was on the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad Board of Directors. He was a powerful man, and he wanted the railroad to come to Milton. So that's where they went. And when they got to Milton, then they had a decision. Do we go to the lead mines in southwest Wisconsin and then to the Mississippi River? And some people wanted to do that. And then others said, no, we should go to Madison, the capital city. And so that's what the railroad then decided, to go up to Madison. But the original route was to go to the west of Lake Wabisa and Lake Higansa. Here's Lake Higansa, Lake Wabisa, and the railroad was going to go to the west. And if that happened, it would have bypassed this area. But then a man heard about the railroad coming through, and he thought, no, I have a nice sawmill, and I want the railroad to come through my community. And so he went and talked to the railroad, and he said, I have a sawmill and a nice small community, and we're willing to build you a depot and give you all the land around the depot so you could have a rail yard. And of course, the railroad thought that was terrific. So Luke Stoughton won that one. And so the railroad then changed its direction and went up to where Luke Stoughton had his sawmill. And instead of going again to the west of Lake Eganza, the railroad decided, well, let's go to the east of Lake Eganza. And that was kind of an odd decision since, as you know, if you're taking the back way from McFarland to Stoughton, there's a lot of marsh. So they put the railroad through the marsh and then came through this area in 1854 and finally arrived in Madison in May of 1854. And they did put a depot in halfway between Stoughton and Madison. It wasn't right here. It was about a mile or two southeast of here, near where the sinkhole was, or near Door Creek. And if you've taken the new boardwalk down by Fish Camp going towards Sunnyside or Springers, there's a lot of marsh there. And so they put this depot over in that general area, so it wasn't the best place. And so the railroad was never happy with the depot being there, and so they were looking for another place to put the depot. And luckily, this man showed up. And he worked for the railroad. This is William McFarland, and he was a carpenter for the railroad, and eventually became the superintendent or the foreman for the carpenters as they were building the railroad coming this direction. And he had been doing that for a number of years, and the railroad, after being in Madison, was continuing on to Prairie du Chien, but he grew tired of that. He lived in Milwaukee, and he didn't like being on the road so much. So he went to his boss and said, I'm going to quit. I'm done with this. I'd like to, just stay in one place. And so the railroad knew they needed to move their depot in a different spot. So they offered William McFarland the chance to buy some land and erect a depot and name the little community and the depot after himself. And so that's what he did in 1856. He purchased the land here and set up a depot, and then eventually a year later built the McFarland House. And that's how McFarland came to be, is all because of the railroad. And William McFarland, it just so happened that he took the route to get here. It was also kind of a lot of turning points in his life. As a 14-year-old, he was in England, got a job on a ship that was going to Charleston, South Carolina. And he thought he would, learn life by getting to work on the ship and understanding a few things. But when they got to Charleston and they had some cargo to take back to England, they discovered another ship had taken the cargo. So instead of wasting money and heading back to England with an empty ship, the ship's captain said, we're just staying here and I'm dismissing the whole crew. So at 14 years old, William McFarland was in Charleston, South Carolina without knowing a person. And he stayed there for 3 years and learned the carpenter's trade. But he didn't like it there because every year he got sick because he wasn't used to the humid climate. And so after the third time of being sick, he said, that's enough of that. So he ventured north and ended up in New York State and wandered around there for 10 years. We really don't know what he did, but he was there for about 10 years. But as the story goes, he came to Milwaukee because he had a brother in Milwaukee. And since he knew carpentry work, he was able to get a job with the railroad. So that's how all that worked out. And it just happened so that he landed here, and we have McFarland as our community. And so why was the railroad a turning point? Well, the main reason is because it's why we exist. But for the first 100 years, the railroad was really important to McFarland for commerce and for communication. And it was our connection to the outside world. All the mail came in and all the mail went out by railroad. The railroad was lined with the telegraph poles, and that's, telegraphs would come into the depot, and if somebody needed to get an emergency telegram out, they'd go to the depot and the depot agent would send it. So it was a really an important connection, and it was a part of the growth. Businesses grew up around the railroad, and all the goods that we needed in McFarland came in from the railroad. So it was a really important turning point that helped, found McFarland, but then also kept us going, even though we were a tiny community. Without the railroad, we would have probably disappeared. And so that takes us to turning point 2, the resorts. And McFarland was just a sleepy little burg in the late 1800s, and the community of McFarland was separated from Lake Wabisa. There was about 3/4 of a mile from the main, our little downtown to the shores of the lake, and in between there were just a few farms, and the farmland went right up to the shores of the lake. So the community of McFarland really didn't have anything to do with the lake area for the first 20 or 30 years. It was all farmland. And when we think of the resorts, we think of Edwards Park and Larson's Beach and those communities along Lake Wabisa. But it's interesting to find out that before those resorts, Lake Wabisa was a big attraction to people in the area just because it was a lovely spot. People loved to go there and have picnics or to go camping. And so I found this interesting, that people went there in as early as the 1880s for camping or for picnics. And this is a photo. It's from the Wisconsin Historical Society collection. And with the photo, the explanation is it's from Madison. And it's a view of the mouth of the Yahara River as it empties into Lake Wabisa. But the more I looked at this photo, I didn't agree with that. I think it's McFarland, and it's where the Yahara River flows out of Lake Wabisa. Because also another reason why I think that is because this photo is taken from a bit of a height. And when you are down by the Yahara River where it flows into Upper Mud Lake, there's no high point around there. So I think it was just mislabeled in the photograph in the Wisconsin Historical Society collection. So I'm going with that this is McFarland. But if anybody has any evidence to show that it's not, but I think it is. But it's interesting, in 1885, the Stoughton Courier-Hub wrote a very short story, and this is a little bit of it. It said, a very pleasant and enjoyable picnic was held at Bringleson's Point on the east shore of Second Lake, participated in by a couple of score of young people of the neighborhood. And then again in 1889, they mentioned Bringleson's Point at the lake now presents the appearance of a small city of tents. Campers are there from Janesville, Madison, Chicago, and other places. And this Bringleson's Point, that was a farmer who had some land where the hill going up to the water tower between today, like Highway 51 and the water tower, his land started there and went to the lake. And it went all the way to the Yahara River like this, where it is there. And then it went north or to the right where Overlook Drive is. So it went up a little bluff there and then came down where Barr's store is along the lake. And then it where the Maple Tree Supper Club is, that was the Bringleson's farm. And so he allowed people to come on his farm over by the lake and go camping and have picnics. And in 1888, the Stoughton Courier-Hub mentioned quite a number of gentlemen from Janesville are camping by the lake of Sever Bringleson's farm. And by the way, they say that it's the finest camping place in the county. And so that's quite amazing. This was a wonderful draw for people in the area back in the 1880s. And there were other brief mentions of people enjoying Lake Wabisa, and one was 1889 in the Stoughton Courier Hub that said, Billy Morrison from Janesville is already camping on the lakeshore. He expects about a dozen tents from his city to be raised here this summer. Verily, McFarland is becoming the summer resort of Dane County. So who would have thought that back in 1889? And then in 1899, the Stoughton Courier Hub mentioned that many of the passenger trains on the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad make short stops on the Lake Wabisa Railroad Bridge to let off and on fishermen and sportsmen. So the lake was a big attraction for the hunters and the fishermen and just people enjoying a day or a week on the lake. And so this was evidence that the lake was really being used heavily and enjoyed. And so there are a couple people who recognized that as well. Ian Edwards and John Larson. I apologize for the poor photograph of John Larson, but these two men noticed all these campers and the sportsmen and fishermen and thought, maybe there's some money to be made in this. And so that's, they were resort entrepreneurs and they saw the potential. And then on June 9th, 1899, the Stoughton Courier Hub reported that Ian Edwards of McFarland has purchased a strip of land lying between the railroad track and Lake Wabisa. They bought it from the Knickerbocker Ice Company. The consideration was $3,000. And so this is quite a bit of money, I think, in 1899. And this took a lot of nerve on Ian Edwards' part because he and his brother Theodore had just moved to town in 1895 to start their business of the hardware and farm implement on Bashford Street. And then in 1898, Ian Edwards built the new fancy house that we know now as the Larson House Museum. And so a year later, he's investing $3,000 buying some land along the lake. So that takes a lot of nerve, I think, to do that. He was 36 years old at that time. And then in June 23rd, 1899, the Stoughton Courier Hub mentioned that the new park at the lakeside will be called Edwards Park. It is a beautiful piece of ground overlooking Lake Wabisa, and we hope to see within a few years that it will be called the most beautiful park in the Northwest. That's saying something. And then July 3rd, 1899, the State Journal also reported the purchase of land for $3,000 and said that Ian Edwards had divided the land into lots and is selling them at $500 each. And that's quite something. He only had to sell 6 to get his money back. And by 1904, some of the lots were being sold for $800. So he was getting people coming, and he thought, okay, I can raise the price, and people will still buy. And Ian's brother Theodore joined him in the resort business a short time later. John Larson was born in the McFarland area in 1862. He was a year older than Ian. He married Julia Vick in 1890, and their first child, Obed, was born in February 1891. And they moved to Lake Wabisa in 1891, a short time after Obed was born, and they purchased the old Schley farm. And this is an ad for the Schley farm in 1879, before John Larson bought it. But here it talks about Lake Wabisa frontage for 1 mile. When John Larson bought the farm, it wasn't that large. It had been broken down into a couple other parcels. But this is the ad for that particular land. And there's a side note, the Schley family is an interesting family. They moved to the McFarland area in the 1860s, and they built the first house on Lake Wabisa. And it was an odd story that they were aristocratic folks from Maryland. And for some reason, they got it in their heads that they wanted to come to Wisconsin and become farmers. But they weren't the type of farmers that the Norwegians and the German immigrants were here. they came here with hired hands, and they had house servants. And one of the interesting stories in the 1870s, they had a big party at their house, and a very famous violinist, Ole Bull from Norway, was actually hired to come and give a concert in their house. And so they realized that they weren't farmers, and then they moved to Milwaukee for business reasons, and then they sold their farm in 1879, and then this is the farm, or a portion of that farm, that John Larson bought. But in the winters, when John Larson wasn't farming, he needed income, so he went to work for the Knickerbocker Ice Company, harvesting ice on the lake, because it was very handy for him to get down there. And John Larson had heard that the Knickerbocker Ice Company in 1900 was planning to sell some of its Lake Waubesa land. And John Larson's son, Obed, in a 1957 article in the State Journal, was quoted saying, "One day, one of the ice company men told Dad that there was something new coming on the market, artificial ice. And it might mean the end of the ice harvest on Waubesa for the Chicago market." And so he went and found Ian Edwards and told him about this idea that they could buy land from the Knickerbocker Ice Company. And Ian Edwards was probably having a good experience with the little land that he already had. So he said, sure. And John Larson hightailed it down to Chicago and to the Knickerbocker Ice Company's office and bought some land. And so both of the men went in on it, and then they both started selling lots. So here's John Larson's farm, where the Schleys had it. It was 200 acres, and here you can see it's only 62 acres. And this is probably the land that John Larson bought from the ice company. And here's Edwards Park up here. So John Larson and Ian Edwards split this land. And here's a little bit of strip of land between the two properties that John Larson owns, and it's the Knickerbocker Ice Company. So they kept a little bit, because they kept harvesting ice for a number of years past 1900. And so Ian Edwards and John Larson start selling more lots. And then in 1900, they built the Edwards Park Store and Hotel. And this photo is probably from the 1920s or 1930s, but when it was built for the campers. They had a store with all the groceries and all their needs that they could buy while camping, and they also had a little hotel. So if you didn't want to buy a lot and build a cottage, you could rent a room for a month or a week or whatever and enjoy the amenities of Lake Waubesa. But it became the focal point for all of the campers in Edwards Park. And it really didn't take long for these lots to fill up. I think Ian Edwards was making a lot of money. And in August 24, 1904, the State Journal reported that people who have camped at Edwards Park on Lake Waubesa assert that it is the most restful, peaceful summer resort to be found anywhere. And their verdict is upheld by great throngs of people who have visited the place this summer. And it just kept going and going. Very popular. In 1910, the State Journal reported Edwards Park consists of 6 blocks upon which are situated 39 cottages. Edwards Park is the largest resort on the lake and is very conveniently situated between the Waubesa Railroad Station and the lake. And so the trains would stop down at Edwards Park. There was a little, place along the tracks where people could wait with an overhang and wait for the train. And then here the people are getting off the train in their Sunday best traveling clothes. But once they got to Edwards Park, maybe they weren't staying there. Maybe they were staying at one of the parks south of there. So there was a boat to meet all of the trains. And the boat would hold 100 people and all the luggage, and they would ferry them to whatever campground that they were staying at. And here's a map, a 1911 map of showing the various resorts all up and down Lake Wabisa. So you've got Edwards Park up here. Larson's Park isn't mentioned on the map, but in 1911 it was there. Zayak's Platte, that was a guy from Rockford. He was an industrialist. He'd come up here and spend his summers. And then we have all these others. Camp Leonard is Leonard Larson. His parents had some farmland there, and Crescent Park and Morris Park. And so it became very popular up and down the entire east shore of Lake Wabisa. And then in 1907, in the spring of 1907, John Larson decided to build his own store, probably a mile or so south of Edwards Park store. So there was a need for it. So you didn't always have to, everybody go to the Edwards Park store or go into town of McFarland to get essentials. So John Larson built this in 1907. And Obed, his son, began working with his father about this time. And local newspapers continue to report on the activities along Lake Wabisa. On August 21st, 1908, the State Journal reported, "Camp life at Lake Wabisa is one continual round of pleasure. Just now, the famous summer resort is at the height of its popularity, with thousands of people are encamped on its shores. Never has there been such a rush for cottages here as has marked the present season. An air of jolly, carefree existence runs through every camp." And the State Journal article continued, "The greatest number of cottages are at Edwards Park, where the cottages form a small village among themselves, many taking their meals at the hotel while others doing their own cooking. As it is now, the various parks along the shore are examples of the real democracy. Looks don't go. Comfort is the whole thing. Dirty clothes and hands are quite in style. Sunbonnets for the women and children and overalls for the men and boys are the prevailing modes of dress." And it was mentioned how the campers here did not want to be like Lake Geneva, where the really rich and famous people from Chicago had their homes. This was more of a summer vacation place where they could just relax. But if you look at these cottages, they're not simple little cottages. They're 2 stories. They're pretty nice. But one special thing about Edwards Park was the dance hall. But by 1914, Ian Edwards was done with the resort business. He had sold all of his lots, so it was time to move on to something else. And he sold the store to Lewis Harrison in 1914. But 2 years earlier, Lewis Harrison and his brother William and Lewis's son Oscar built the Edwards Park Dance Pavilion. And then starting in 1912, dancing became a major draw to Edwards Park, not just for the campers, but for people in Madison and people in McFarland. They just all went there, and bands played, and it was not just once a week, it was often throughout the week. And so it was a special draw for Edwards Park. And even the people in McFarland, it wasn't easy just to get over to Edwards Park. We think of it as, just hop in the car or get on your bike and it's easy. There was no simple, straightforward road to get there. And so some people in McFarland took the train to Edwards Park, and so they could go to the dances. But like all good things have to come to the end, and the resort business was kind of winding down, and one big reason why it was not as popular is because of the sewage problem in Lake Wabisa. Starting in the late 1920s and lasting for decades, was a problem that greatly hurt the resort business. That sewage effluent from the Madison sewage plant was pumped directly into the lake. And there was a letter to the editor in the State Journal in 1934. This man actually wrote the letter to the mayor of Madison, And then he sent a copy to the State Journal. And it's a really long letter, but I'm just going to read a portion of it so you get a feel of the problem of the sewage in the lake. And he said, "Dear Sir, I wish to voice a very vigorous protest against the present intolerable conditions existent here at Lake Wabisa. We have owned property on the lake for 11 years, and each summer we come from our Chicago home to spend from 4 to 7 months on this lakeshore. Heretofore, we have usually come early in the spring and remained until late fall because we have so thoroughly enjoyed the quiet beauty of this inland lake. We have bathed in its waters, fished in its waters, motored on its waters, basked in the cooling breezes of this once beautiful body of water. Each year, however, for some years past, these waters have been more and more contaminated. Each year, the beaches have grown less inviting and the fishing less fruitful. This year, we were detained in Chicago until Monday of this week. We motored here Monday, bringing house guests with us, and imagine our consternation, our chagrin, and our utter embarrassment when we drove into our yard and invited these guests to view beautiful Lake Wabisa. They made a heroic effort to retain their facial composure and their recent breakfast. If you can imagine all the outhouses for a good-sized city suddenly assembled and open to the sun-scorching rays, you may have some conception of the odor that emanated from Wabisa Monday and that continues to rise to nauseate us and give us sick headaches. We had planned to remain until late October or November, but unless some very immediate and thorough steps are taken to rid the lake of this vile, green, seething, odoriferous scum, we shall be compelled to lock our house here and return to Chicago, as we now find all of our friends have done within the past month. This condition is literally intolerable." And so that's the situation that the resorts had to put up with. It was just impossible for people to stay there because there was just a terrible smell. And the scum and the algae on the lake was very thick. In fact, there was a story in the State Journal of August 11, 1946, where the headline was "Wabisa, nicest lake in state being fouled by sewage." And this was an interview with Obed Larson, who owned Larson's Beach. And he said, along in the early 1930s, the lake began to get worse and worse. And by 1935, it was a stinker. And Larson will never forget those terrible days. The bay out there, he says, got so thick with scum from algae nourished by the effluent that a small dog could walk on it. We had to cut a channel to get out to open water by boat. He said, "I had 10 cottages full of people during 2 of the worst weeks, and they all just melted away. They never came back either. People would drive in looking for a place to stay. I'd see them open the car doors and then, after one smell of the lake, close the doors and drive away. But it won't get better in my day with all those nitrates and phosphates down in the bottom of the lake," says the man whose livelihood for a half century has come from a lake he figures the city of Madison has spoiled for him and for this area. And so that's a very unfortunate thing, but it took decades and decades. But Obed Larson was one of the leaders of a group to lobby the city of Madison to basically clean up its act. And it took a long, long time. And another thing that just changed, well, the dance hall burned down in 1940, but they rebuilt it. And so there was a new dance hall in 1941, which still stands behind that restaurant to the south, the Mekong restaurant. Now it used to be 5100 Club, but that dance hall is still there. But especially after World War II, a lot of the cottages were being remodeled into year-round homes. So the owners stayed, and so it wasn't a resort area anymore. It was a neighborhood. And so, but still, I think it was a turning point in McFarland's history because it was so unique and special. It put McFarland on the map. Starting in 1900, it was thousands of people would come here every summer just to be by the lake, and McFarland was known as the vacation land of southern Wisconsin. And I think it prevented industrial development because of John Larson and Ian Edwards seeing that there was potential for a resort community. The Knickerbocker Ice Company could have sold it to some other commercial outfit, and it could have had a totally different future if that would have happened. And it's the resort people who really fought hard to get Lake Wabisa cleaned up. And today it's a very unique neighborhood. If you go for a walk or a bike ride down in Edwards Park area, going towards where Larson's Beach was, all those little roads, and you can get lost in a little section, but it's a special, very special area of McFarland. And then also, I don't have it here, but in 1955, it was annexed to McFarland, because when I say it's a special place of McFarland, for all those years up to 1955, it wasn't part of McFarland, it was Blooming Grove, and then south there is town or gun for Larson's Beach and those places further south. So it wasn't until 1955 Edwards Park was annexed, and with that, it doubled McFarland's population. Can anyone guess what the third turning point is?
51?
Yeah.
Highway 51.
Yes.
Yeah.
There you go. Very good. This is a turning point, I think, not only for what it did, but for what it didn't do. And I think that's the key. It was constructed starting in 1928, and it was finished in the summer of 1929. And so, cars were around since the late 1800s, but really very few of them. But it wasn't until the 1920s when car ownership really exploded. Like in, for example, 1920, there were 8 million car registrations in the entire United States. And a decade later, it had tripled. And so people were getting used to the idea of cars in the 1920s. And here's McFarland's first car. It was owned by the Amy family, Freeman Amy. But driving the car is Freeman's son, Frank. And this is July 4th, 1909 in McFarland. And sitting next to Frank in the front seat is his mother, Eliza. And right behind Frank is his sister, Bess. And the other woman in the back is a friend of Bess, Lula Markward. And so this is kind of an interesting photo. I like it because right in the foreground in the center is this bright colored car. And then on the left side, it's very dark, where you have 2 horse and buggies. And so you're seeing the transition happening right there in this photograph. And you can see the street, it's just dirt. And it would stay that way for a long time, but this was McFarland's future. And so this is a 1911 map, and just showing the roads coming in and out of McFarland. So this road here is what is now Highway MN, and Creamery Road going down to Elgin Road, Exchange Street, and this is Farwell. Then it would get what we call Burma Road now, and that would take you down to the lake in 1911. And then Marsh Road and Sigilco. And so all of these roads in 1911, of course, were dirt. And if they weren't dirt, then they were mud, depending on how the weather was. And one of the things that the cars, being on the increase, was businesses that needed to service them. And this is 1916, just 7 years after the first car was on McFarland Street. And now we have a building that was focused on cars. The Bert Autumn and Arn Thompson opened a garage September 1916. It was a gas station. It was a service garage, and they also sold cars. First selling Overland cars, but then they dropped that brand quickly and focused on being a Ford dealership. Melvin Lewis, a farmer in McFarland, took over the Overland Agency, and also in 1916, Gerhard Edwards, E.N. Edwards' brother, sold Buicks in McFarland. So in 1916, we had 3 car dealerships. The Adam Thompson garage was the largest one. I don't know if Gerhard Edwards and Melvin Lewis lasted very long with their selling of cars, but the Adam Thompson Ford dealership lasted for at least 10 years, if not more. And Adam and Thompson in 1918 sold 18 new Fords just in the springtime, and were constantly selling all of the cars allotted to them by the Ford Motor Company. And so the Adam Thompson garage was a big deal, being right on Main Street. It was a 120 by 50-foot building equipped with a hot air furnace and an electrical lighting system. A newspaper article stated that the facility was one of the finest of its kind in southern Wisconsin. In 1917, they had a well dug so they could start a car wash business. And that was really filling a great need considering the condition of the roads, which are always dusty or muddy. And so with the roads, with the influx of all these cars, the road infrastructure was quickly overwhelmed. And this is just another map of the roads. And getting from McFarland to Stoughton, there's only one way to go. And here's Stoughton. I'm just assuming, I have an idea, this is like Page Street that would connect to Williams Drive, and it'd go up north until it would hit what is now MN, and then go west into McFarland. And so that was the only way to get to Stoughton in those days. And this is a 1918 map. And here's just another map, 1919, and it just shows the other direction of McFarland. There was the road that would go out across Yahira River, that would be Exchange Street, and then it would just wind around to get to like what is now Mahoney Road, and Mahoney Road would then take you down to what is now County Highway B. And according to the key on the left of the map, all those roads were, dirt. And in 1919, the federal government and the Wisconsin Highway Commission started making plans for a better road system, better highway system. And but it took them until 1926 to announce it, because it was a major plan, and it took a lot of time to come up with it. And as you know, they were making U.S. highways going west to east and north to south, and they were coming up with a highway numbering system. And let's see if I have it here. Yeah. And so here's the highway coming out of Stoughton again, and they have it. It's Highway 10 that would come into McFarland and go up to the Madison area. And if you look at 10, it goes all the way up to Portage and then beyond. And so it's following pretty much the route of today's Highway 51, except between McFarland and Stoughton. And so the highway, the federal highway plan, of course, all of their north-south roads are numbered in odd numbers, and the east-west are even numbers. And so this north-south number that the state had with 10 had to be changed. And so it's interesting that Wisconsin was the first state in the country to have numbered highways. And so they changed that number to 51. And for a while, 51 came out of Stoughton and went the same route up to what is now MN and would go into McFarland. So as you drive out on MN these days, it used to be Highway 51 way back in 1926. But this map shows what the State Highway Commission wanted to do with the old Highway 51. They wanted to create a bypass west of McFarland, this dark line, and they wanted to come down to Stoughton and getting rid of this route. But that's something that didn't fit well or sit well with McFarland business people. They felt like they were going to be bypassed and not get any business. And so they were a little upset with that. And they went to the Highway Commission and they proposed their plan. And their plan was to have the Highway 51 come through McFarland, come through downtown, and go out on the east side of Lake Egansa and get Stoughton that way. And so as you see, it basically, they were saying it should parallel the railroad tracks. And again, that was kind of a crazy thing because you're going through a lot of marsh. But that's what the McFarland option was that they were presenting to the Highway Commission in 1926. The Highway Commission said, no, we're sticking with the west route. And McFarland didn't give up. So again, in 1927, they went to the Highway Commission and they submitted a petition of 3,000 people who signed wanting the east route. And I don't know where they came up with 3,000 people because McFarland at that time had maybe 300 people and half of those were children. And so, yeah, there were some farmers along this route that wanted it too, but still you wouldn't get to 3,000 people. So I still don't know how they came up with that number. I saw it in the paper a couple times that they had a petition of 3,000 people. And then one other article mentioned 2,000, but still that's a pretty high number. But anyway, they submitted this petition to the Highway Commission, and but the Highway Commission was not swayed by that, and they said, no, we're sticking with the west route. But the residents of and officials of Stoughton and of the town of Dunn who lived in this portion of the town of Dunn wanted this route because they felt the highway would be best suited to their interest. And so there's this debate, and the debate got pretty heated. But Dr. William McLaughlin, who is this well-known doctor in McFarland, was at that meeting, and he spoke at the hearing stating that McFarland would be utterly ruined if the west route, which passes outside the village proper, were adhered to. He said it would make little difference to a city the size of Stoughton, but a little village couldn't stand it. And so the Highway Commission still voted against the McFarland plans, but that wasn't the end of it. McFarland planned to appeal, and so they did in November 1927. But they had a different idea. So they were accepting the west route. They were going to abandon the east route here, but they said, okay, you can come up here, but when you get past Colladade Point, have it veer a little bit and go on the east side of Mud Lake so the road will still eventually go through downtown McFarland. And the Highway Commission didn't like that either. They said it would cost too much. They said it would cost $24,000 more. And one of the reasons that they give, I'll go back here, they were talking about a subway. And that I was trying to figure out what they meant by that. But it wasn't really explained, but one of the things that the Highway Commission really was proud of as they're making all these new highways, that they could eliminate as many railroad crossings as possible. And so that's why on Highway 51, which used to be Terminal Drive, or where Terminal Drive is now, they had a bridge going over the railroad tracks, and they were very proud of that because they wanted to eliminate train-car accidents. And so if they came east of Mud Lake, I'm guessing they had to go across the tracks over by AV, and they didn't want that, so they were going to dig under the tracks. And so I think that's what they meant by a subway. and that's what the construction problems were. And so I'm guessing that they would go under the tracks, go out to where MN is now, and come into McFarland from the east. And so that was too much money. And so Bert Autumn was quoted in the paper saying, the difference in the cost kind of knocks the thunder out of anything I might want to say. It makes our case hopeless. We have always felt that our village absolutely needed this road. We thought this new proposal might work out. I wish it were possible for the commission to devise some way to bring the road nearer to us. Once again, Dr. McLaughlin was devastated, saying the proposed route that bypasses McFarland will virtually kill McFarland in the years to come. And so, this is headline news for over a year. And so most people would say, okay, we lost again and we'll give up, but not McFarland. The McFarland residents were still not finished. In February of 1928, Bert Autumn, the McFarland's representative to the Dane County Board, urged the board to ask the Highway Commission to reroute the highway. But his proposal eventually failed, but it was a very, very close vote. And a group of McFarland citizens filed a lawsuit in June against the Highway Commission, but it too failed. An editorial appeared in the July 14th, 1928 Cap Times, where it said, to McFarland citizens, dear friends, far be it from us to try to judge the proper location of a state trunk highway, as our engineering experience has been confined to the extensive operation of installing ribbons on typewriters. But we think you are to be commended for the valiant fight you waged to bring Highway 51 through your village. The battle, even though it be lost, has shown that McFarland residents possess the up and atom spirit that is essential if any growing community is to retain its place in the fast-moving suns of the modern USA. The leaders in the fight for the highway, Frank Sigelco, Harley Patterson, Tullough Lewis, J. Edward Reed, J.S. Johnson, H.A. Kellner, Theodore Edwards, Melvin Lewis, August Yankee, and Seifert Johnson should be awarded the McFarland DSC, I guess Distinguished Service, some certificate or something, or some other form of recognition of the meritorious services for the village. And so, they lost, but eventually the road was built where the Highway Commission wanted, going west of McFarland. And here's the headline, when the highway opened. Highway 51 opens new scenic vista for southern Wisconsin trips. And the story with that headline said, exactly 11.2 miles of new concrete paving, most of it a relocation of the highway, today is carrying motorists through a beautiful country, most of them seen it for the first time. Heretofore, the region has been accessible only by means of rough and narrow country roads. And the article continued, McFarland, it seems, wanted the highway to go through the town. McFarland probably will be thankful it lost its case when the tourist hordes start sweeping through on the new highway. The new highway is expected to be especially popular with tourists because of its scenery and the fact that it passes through a famous resort country. And so there you are, and McFarland's a turning point because of improved transportation and the vacation land. Tourists didn't just come by train anymore, they drove. But the main thing is it kept the heavy traffic out of downtown. I can't imagine how McFarland would have been if Highway 51 went down Main Street. It would have changed things dramatically. And having a U.S. highway where it was a big reason I think that McFarland got the tank farms. And the eventual economic development, there wasn't economic development right away. So the road opened in 1929. It wasn't until about 1959, it was 30 years later, where the first business, I think, maybe opened. Arnold Larson of the Badger Petroleum built a gas station and the Badger truck stop down on the corner of Harwell and Highway 51. And then, I don't know exactly when the Supper Club, which now is the Maple Tree, when that opened. But it took a while for McFarland to go out towards the highway with businesses. But it didn't, after 1959, the traffic kind of faded because Interstate 90 was put in around 1962. And so Arnold Larson's truck stop, when it was first built, there were semi-trucks constantly around it, truckers would stop. But when Interstate 90 opened, the trucks took that route and didn't stop in McFarland. All right. And then the fourth turning point, which I think is also an obvious one.
Tank Farms.
Yes.
Yeah.
There you go. The tank farms
High
and the high school, because they're so interconnected. And so without the tank farms, there would have been no high school built at that time. Maybe eventually, but it may have taken a whole lot longer than it did. But there were a variety of events that led to the construction of the high school after the tank farms were built. But in January of 1954, that's the first time anybody heard about this project of these petroleum storage tanks coming to the Madison area. And Blooming Grove site was being considered as a potential landing spot for this project. But there were 14 other sites in the Madison area that were being considered, with a special interest in 13 of them. And I haven't been able to figure out what those other sites were, where they were located, but it was important that whatever site they chose was by a railroad track. And so there again, our first turning point, the railroad, helped get to our fourth turning point, because without the railroad and a U.S. highway going right by it, the Blooming Grove site wouldn't have been considered very seriously, I doubt. The location was on farmland, one farm owned by Emil Shadall, who was the father-in-law to Elmer Erdahl, who had owned that land for a while, and another farm owned by Mary Gunderson. And construction of these tanks began in the spring of 1954. And at the same time, the Badger Pipeline was being constructed, and it went in operation in 1955. So that Badger Pipeline came from some refineries outside of Chicago, and it went over towards Rockford, and then it came up north. And I think another reason why the Blooming Grove site was considered, because we're quite close to where the pipeline was coming from. They could save some money by coming to one of the closest sites, because we were on the southeast side of Madison, closest to Rockford. And so by the spring of 1955, the gasoline was being distributed from these tanks. And at that time, McFarland didn't have any jurisdiction over where the tank farms were located. It was in the town of Blooming Grove, and it was in the Wabisa School District. And the high school district at that time was probably Madison East. But things started changing right at the same time. First was with the Wabisa School. There was a problem with overcrowding at the Wabisa School. And the residents there had to pick between two options, either add on to their school or join the McFarland's school district. And there was a referendum in the spring of 1954, and the residents there voted in favor of joining the McFarland's school district by a margin of 2-1. And this was a critical event for this whole episode, because it brought the Wabisa School District, located in Blooming Grove, into the McFarland Elementary School District. And this is the land where the tank farms are being built. So it was a very important thing. So here's Sequoia Road, and the Wabisa School is right here. And this is the whole southwest portion of Blooming Grove. And so this is all of the Wabisa School District. And the tank farms are a part of that, and they're over here. And this is a 1960 map, but it doesn't reflect the new route of Highway 51. This is the original Highway 51, which is now Terminal Drive. And it went right by these tank farms. But they, about 1959, starting at Larson's Beach, they had the bypass that just went around it and hooked up over by Bogus Road again. And so that was just considered because of all the truck traffic. They had to keep the regular traffic away from the tank farms. But anyway, the school district, Waukeesa School District, now becoming part of the McFarland Elementary School District, was a big step forward in McFarland getting the tank farms eventually. Another big thing that happened around that time in November 1955, McFarland annexed Edwards Park, which is the shaded area, and Idlewild, which is south of Edwards Park, just above Larson's Beach. And it wasn't because McFarland wanted that property, it was because the residents there were not happy with Blooming Grove. Because there were a lot of residents in Edwards Park, and they didn't feel like they were getting noticed by Blooming Grove for street improvements or whatever issues that they had. And so it was the Blooming Grove residents that petitioned McFarland to have them annex Edwards Park. And so McFarland did that. And then another big thing that happened in 1955, in the fall of 1955, the Monona Grove High School opened. And so that changed things as well, because not only then was this area in the McFarland Elementary School District, it was now also in the Monona Grove High School District. So there was a potential battle there and a sharing of the tax-based revenue between the two school districts. And then later in 1958 and 59, both the city of Madison and at the time the village of Monona were actively trying to annex the Blooming Grove land holding the tank farms. And while they were doing that, McFarland's just kind of sitting back, not actively seeking that. And in both cases with Monona and Madison, they were not doing well. They weren't getting enough signatures to allow them to annex that land. And so they were kind of failing at that. And McFarland was just kind of on the sidelines. But the action that Monona and Madison were taking of wanting to annex that property kind of got the residents there thinking, well, we don't want to be annexed to Madison. We don't want to be annexed to Monona. We'd rather be annexed to McFarland. And so this residents of that area voted or signed a petition. 38 of the 39 residents signed a petition to be annexed to McFarland. And so that was a very big key. And so McFarland, the village of McFarland, then annexed that area. And there were a lot of the signatures included Robert Amy, this is still Blooming Grove, Timmerman, and Shadle. They were on that. And so right in 1959, this line here is the dividing between Blooming Grove and McFarland, and this line was Amy Road, which is what we consider in the middle of the village, but at this time it was all country north of there. And so McFarland took all of this land over to Marsh Road and then north. And so that all became part of the village of McFarland, which was a key to getting the tank farms. And but another thing that happened in 1959, the state legislature passed what they call the High School District Attachment Law, which would go into effect on June 30th, 1962. And it was that thing that really got McFarland's attention, because that law would make it illegal to take territory out of a high school district, which Monona still had that as its high school district. It would be illegal to take that out of that high school district without placing it in an operating high school district. And so McFarland couldn't take that and just say, it's ours, but this new law would not allow that. And so, of course, then McFarland had to act fast. And so that's what they did. They started as a community having planning meetings and deciding how we were going to go about getting a high school. And one of the other key components to this tank farm event was the Dane County Public School Committee. And they would hold hearings with the McFarland Elementary School District and talk about the attachment law. And I feel like the people on the Dane County Public School Committee were very open and agreeable to McFarland's task at hand to try to get a high school. And they voted often against Monona and Madison, but they were always very favorable with McFarland. And finally, the Dane County Public School Committee said, yes, McFarland should have its own high school. And once that happened, McFarland built a high school. And so that was opened in the fall of 1962. And so they beat that deadline of what the legislature said of June 1962, but construction had started in 1961. So everything was above board, even though Madison and Monona objected to McFarland's annexation in 1959, and that started a 3-year court battle. But the court battle didn't finish until later in 1963. So even though our high school had been in session for a whole year, it was kind of a moot point. And so there we are that McFarland has its high school because of the tank farms, and the tank farms had this big tax base that allowed us to spend money to build a high school. And so why were the tank farms a turning point? Well, the tax base that it offered, and McFarland was able, through all those events, to get that tax base and then to build the high school. And then the tank farms helped with the growth of the village and the village infrastructure. Shortly after the high school, or maybe at the same time it was being built, McFarland put in, we were attached to the Madison Metropolitan Sewage District. Before that, everybody had a septic tank and just pumped out their sewer wherever. And so that was a key. And we got natural gas put in at the same time, and we got curb and gutters. And so the ditches were kind of replaced with better streets. And it was just a big economic boost for McFarland. And so, as I see it, those are the 4 turning points in McFarland. But the interesting thing is, when the tank farms were built in 1955, that was 70 years ago. And I don't have a turning point since then, so maybe someone here has a turning point since 1955, but that's what I came up with. So I appreciate you listening, and if you have any questions or comments that you think should have been a turning point, I'd be happy to hear it.
Thank you.
I do have one question in particular. I've noticed a couple times throughout the presentation, 2 times in particular, one in one of the newspapers, it said McFarland, M-A-C-F-A-R-L-A-N, not M-C. And another one I saw M''Farland.
Yeah.
Is there a reason why they can't seem to get our name right? Communications?
Yeah, back in the early days, they couldn't. But I think the post office, U.S. Post Office, listed us as MAC. And so that was official for a long time, even though the village and William McFarland went by MC. But I think in the 1920s, there was finally, 1920, McFarland became a village, but incorporated as a village. And at that time, with the village government, I think they made a proposal to the state and to the U.S. Postal Service. This is our official spelling. So it took a while, but the newspapers, they'll do whatever they feel like.
Did Madison ever do anything to rectify that problem with all the sewage that wrecked the tourism or the resort industry in the 20s? Or
Yeah.
was that it? Was that the end of it?
Well, they improved their sewage plant and quit dumping the effluent directly into the lake. But it took decades. And I think the lakes are still feeling the effects of, like Ron Larson said, all those phosphates and nitrates, they're still down in there. And
From 100 years ago.
yeah. And so, I don't think there was any compensation that the city of Madison ever gave to the lake owners or anything like that.
So after the 20s, the lakes were basically kaput for swimming and.
Well, yeah,
tourism.
we still swam in them. I don't know. And I guess, people still, Larson's Beach still operated until 1983 as a resort, and they had a few cottages, and people would come there and buy bait and minnows, and it was still being used as that type of thing, but it not like it used to be. And then Larson's Beach went out of business or sold, and they retired. And a couple of restaurants took over, and then not too long ago, the last restaurant closed, and Larson's Beach is covered up with fancy condos. Any thoughts about another turning point? Because McFarland's changed a whole lot since 1955, but I can't think of a real specific event that happened that changed. It's kind of been gradual, the development and growth. And I saw somebody mention in a newspaper article that the new Beltline that opened in like 1988 or 1989 was a turning point and really made it easy for people living in McFarland to, go to Madison for work or school. And so that could have been a turning point for
Residential growth.
residential growth, yes. Mm-hmm.
What about the development of all the conservation parks that are out and around? Is that something, turning point for the town? And that's all past, 20, 30 years?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that just shows McFarland's interest in retaining their natural environment and helping with the people who live here and live in a nicer place. But I think that maybe another turning point might be the Lower Yahara bike trail. Who knows what that might do for tourism or economic boost with people coming through town, especially if they now can go from eventually Madison to Stoughton whenever it's finished completely. But that, I think that's a big part of McFarland's history.
Well, building this lovely library, of course. We remember the bookmobile.
Yeah. No, that's a turning point in 2005. And I think when we were studying getting a library here, initially down in the shopping center across from the high school, we were talking about how it could draw businesses into town, because I think I kind of recall one business saying that they came to McFarland because we had a library. So that's an important thing to consider, and people will move here because there's a library. And so I think families find that a very important turning point.
Another one of the big industries, though, was the carp seining.
What?
The carp seining.
Oh, the carp seining, yeah. Down over.
I wouldn't call it a real turning point, but it's some economic development.
Yes, and then the carp would be shipped out to New York City, and it was a delicacy in the restaurants of Manhattan that had McFarland carp. So, and then the ice harvesting was also a big business that was relied upon by the Chicago people. So, a lot of industries that have gone away but were important back in the day. But I appreciate your attention and thank you very much for coming. And I've actually finished